Blunders. How Jurassic Park could have avoided losing innocent lives and successfully launched the greatest theme park of all time through proper policy and procedure. So full disclosure, like I was saying to some of you before, when Jacob first approached me with this topic, I had to admit I'd never seen the film. So the first thing we had to do was watch it. And not only was I thoroughly entertained, but I also saw his point right away. This is the exact premise of the movie. A bunch of auditors show up, worried about their investments, and turns out Jurassic Park wasn't really quite ready for their audit. And you don't want the same thing to happen to you, where auditors show up and you're not quite ready and people start getting eaten by dinosaurs. So, you know, compliance is normally a pretty boring and dreary topic, so spice it up with some dinosaurs, make it a little more exciting, and see what we can do with that. Introduction about myself: if you haven't met me before, you don't know me, Victor Weis, lead technical engineer at DataYard. Like Jacob was saying, I do a lot with helping our NIST 800-171 customers get compliant. Something we spent a lot of time the past year, because there's a big need for it. A lot of people have a huge list of requirements, need a pathway to get there. So we've been doing a lot to help in that pathway. And NIST 800-171 is essentially a government compliance requirement that applies to any DoD contractors, any subcontractors, even if they don't directly interface with DoD themselves. Anybody who is working it through the DFARS program, and really any CUI, any controlled unclassified information of any sort, if you have it in your systems, technically you're required to be compliant. And the scope of what is CUI has grown so much to, if you're basically doing anything with the Department of Defense, almost all of that data has components that are CUI and fall under these requirements. Quick timeline on this to review. The first draft was published in 2016, the 110 specific controls. There's a ton in there, and there's no way we could cover all of those today. You could spend an hour on each control talking about all the different strategies and ways to meet those. So we're just gonna focus on a few highlights in the time that we have today. But the whole process of what CUI is, its definition, all the policies and procedures around it wasn't really finalized until 2017. It's something that had started 12 years ago through an executive order from President Bush. So you can see how quickly the government moves. It took them 12 years to just define what CUI is and what kinds of policies and procedures were going to be in place. But once it was finalized, they made an announcement that come January 1 of 2018, that's the deadline, you have to be compliant. People flipped out all over the place because they weren't anywhere nearly ready. Additional provisions were made in 2018. They put out clarifying document, DoD guidance for reviewing system security plans, and the NIST 800-171 security requirements not yet implemented. Basically, it was just a document that said if you're not compliant yet, not the end of the world. What you need is a plan, documented, of how you're going to become compliant in the next 2 to 3 years. And so as long as you had that document, you could still be covered. But then 2019, they released another document outlining specific portions of your plan that need to be met by certain deadlines. So they're starting to get serious, and it's pretty clever the way that the contractor and subcontractor structure works is there's not nearly enough government auditors to go around and audit every single DoD contractor. But now if you have a partner, a customer that you're working with on these contracts, you have to keep each other accountable to certain degrees. So we're already starting to see auditors pop up, mostly from larger contractors to smaller ones. But things are getting serious now, so it's a very prescient topic. Quick overview of some DataBites commitments, something we say at every DataBites. We're vendor agnostic. We maybe have our favorite solution stacks, you have yours, but at the end of the day, it's the right tool for the right job. That depends on your particular requirements and environment. So you'll hear me mention some names of different solutions, but no favoritism there. Also, no sales pitches. This is just about great information that you can use and apply in your business. If you want to talk specifics about opportunities or anything like that, ping Jacob or me or Alec after. We can get into the nitty-gritty of those things. So let's get right into it. Our first Jurassic Park's clip. You didn't say the magic word. So just a refresher, if it's been a while, I know 1993 was a while ago. Dennis Redry has gone rogue. He's a programmer, sysadmin, basically the only one of the whole park, and he's pretty disgruntled about his pay and treatment, and he's causing havoc in the park. So Ray Arnold is trying to save the day, but has a little bit of a access control problem.
Access main program. Access main security. Access main program grid.
You didn't say the magic word.
Please!
You don't want to become Ray Arnold where you're stuck with a serious emergency and can't get into your systems. You'll be chain smoking as many cigarettes as he was and saying all sorts of colorful language.
There's those old keyboards, something like that.
Yeah, you can't replicate that sound anymore unless you buy mechanical guys. But yeah, you don't want to end up in that situation. So there's three big sections of NIST that cover essentially what he was going through. That's 3.1, which is authentication, the first part of AAA. It's basic, or 3.5 is authentication. Who are you, essentially, your identity for the system. Then the second A in AAA is authorization. Are you allowed to do what you're trying to do? And then the third A is auditing. Who did what when? So that's 3.1, 3.3, and 3.5. All three of those aspects are provided by an identity management system or a directory services. We're probably in this room, most of us familiar with Windows Active Directory. It's the big player in that field, but there's a bunch of others. There's OpenLDAP in the Linux world. Apple has their Open Directory. There's a bunch of cloud native ones like Jump Cloud and Okta and Auth0 and others that are very attractive these days for cloud native companies who want to be agile. So we're all pretty familiar, I think, with the mainstays of what a directory services does. The key for these requirements is getting into those each one of those different line items about the encryption standards and the way it authenticates and things. The devil's in the details. If you have a system today, chances are it can be compliant, but it just maybe needs some configuration and some tweaking to make it so. But something I wanted to talk about today that I see a big problem with is getting better AAA through single sign-on systems. Single sign-on is basically just a way to have one identity management system to rule all your other identity management systems. It's a way to integrate AAA from all your different systems via LDAP, Radius, SAML, TACX, a lot of different protocols that let different systems tie in together to talk to your directory services. You see this a lot in environments where maybe you have a Windows Active Directory server and your Windows workstations can talk to it, and easy enough to manage those. But what happens when you got some Mac laptops thrown in, your Wi-Fi and your VPN? You need ways to tie all of those in, and it can be done so that way you don't have as big of a compliance burden of having to manage user accounts in 10 different places, having to keep audit logs in 10 different places. So it can really be applicable to all your different systems. Macs included. There's a way to tie Macs into a domain, Windows Active Directory domain, and those other solutions that exist. And it's not nearly as hateful as it used to be. This Mac is actually on our domain right now, and it's a pretty nice way to manage local accounts centrally instead of on each individual workstation. Same with Wi-Fi. A lot of people today are using WPA2 PSK, or just, what's the security key that you put in to get on the network? That's technically not FIPS validated, so it's not NIST compliant. The reason is it's not replay resistant. It's very easy for somebody on the network to send a DOF code and re-listen for the handshake that happens next time your computer auto reconnects. And then they have your private key pair that they can then eavesdrop on the connections on the network. So that means everybody who is under the NIST controls is going to have to get radius authentication, which means for the Wi-Fi, each person needs their own username and password. If you don't have that yet today, that is something to be thinking about for the future. Same with your Ethernet access. Most networks, if there's open jacks on a wall or open jacks on a switchboard, people can just come in and plug in a cable and they're on the network. NIST is going to require that you have the same 802.1x authorization, requiring at least a username and a password, if not a cryptographic security certificate in addition to that. Same goes for VPN, your web and cloud applications, the administrative or even physical access. If you have a prox card system and it has a separate identity management system from your domain, you just doubled your compliance burden. If you can get your prox card system talking to your central identity management system, makes life a lot easier. And this is something I've run into a ton. To show you a quick real world example. Here's a typical network you see where you have one sysadmin at a small shop who's managing all these different systems, and me, an old auditor, shows up and wants to see, okay, what are the logs? What users do you have on which systems? And this one's pretty easy over here. Windows Active Directory server, and that's good for my Windows server and my Windows workstations, but I didn't join my hypervisor to the domain, and I got this Linux VM, and oh, I forgot about this one that I have an AWS GovCloud, and there's this cloud app, how do I even integrate that? And you end up with long hours, prone to human error that an auditor is gonna ask even more questions about, and makes your burden even higher. And you have to redo that every single time an auditor shows up wanting to see some evidence of if you're compliant or not. Instead, if you do get all those different systems tied in through different methods, Linux and Mac can get tied in through LDAP-S, like we talked about with the Wi-Fi, you can tie it in through Radius, same with the switch ports, same with your VPN access on the firewall. Cloud apps can get tied in with security assertion markup language or SAML. All of these different systems have ways to be able to talk to your centralized identity management system. And now, if you have a disgruntled employee like Dennis Nedry who leaves or is causing havoc on the network, instead of having to rush to try to shut down or disable accounts in 10 different places, you have one place to go, and you don't have to worry about, did I forget this other user account on this system that I haven't touched in a while. There are some concerns too that people have about, if you have a centralized place to log in and all these different systems exist, if one of them's compromised, now they can get into all of them. But in reality, most users use the same password anyways on different systems. And even if they don't, you still have a very easy way to shut down access on all those systems at once. And we'll talk about some other requirements that also help mitigate that concern next with regards to multi-factor. The other concern people have a lot is, well, what happens if my Active Directory server is down? Now I can't get into all my critical systems. And that is a concern, so if you have uptime requirements, you want to plan in some sort of high availability backup domain controller in Windows Active Directory, or maybe you federate with Azure in the cloud or with Jump Cloud in the cloud, so that you have some sort of redundancy, that if one of your directory services is down, not everybody's locked out, you can still get into your systems. Before I move on from AAA stuff, any questions so far about any of that? And I know we'll probably have a range of, people wanting high-level technical information, people wanting really low. If I'm glossing over something, you want more detail, just raise your hand and flag me down. I'll dive into it in more detail. Another big one that I wanted to point out is specifically 353, the requirement for multi-factor. What you're going to see is a ton of fine print that you probably can't read from there, and you probably shouldn't read it because it's scary. This is actually from the document itself, including the footnotes that they brought out. And basically what it's saying is that you have to have multi-factor authentication for any system on the network. The only thing that doesn't fall under this control is if it's a system that's totally isolated off the network that you're sneaker netting USB drives to, it doesn't need multi-factor. Everything else does. And so we'll talk a little bit about what does this control really mean when you decipher all the fine print. First, let's talk about why multi-factor authentication in the first place. Aren't passwords enough? Well, passwords are very vulnerable to a number of attacks, including phishing, where somebody sends a fake email that says, hey, click this link, you need to reset your password. You put in your password, and now they know your password. Happens all the time. Oftentimes, end users are the weakest link in your security fabric. And we'll talk about some ways you can help mitigate phishing as well a little bit later on, but brute force is another big problem. People just constantly trying, random passwords or a dictionary of passwords until they get in. You also have password database breaches where somebody's system got hacked, they got all the hashes of all the passwords for all the users, and they started putting it through rainbow tables and getting your passwords out. Keyloggers, where they can get software or hardware on your system that eavesdrops on the keystrokes that you put into your computer, and eavesdropping, where we talked about the handshake attack with Wi-Fi. You can get people's passwords through that. Also man-in-the-middle attacks, where people hijack DNS and SSL and get fake websites going that are there to collect passwords. All these are big attack vectors for passwords alone. If you have multi-factor authentication, it protects against all of these. And there's other ways to mitigate those threats, but multi-factor is the single best one that takes care of all of these concerns at the same time. So that's why the DoD, the NIST controls are so adamant that everything has to have multi-factor. So let's talk about what it really is. What is multi-factor authentication? So it's of that AAA portion. There's the authorization, who are you? The authentication, are you allowed to do it? And the auditing. You don't have to have multi-factors for those other two pieces. It's just the authentication portion. Are you allowed to do what you want to do? And what multi-factor really means, it doesn't mean you have to have 3 or 7 or 10. It just means you have to have 2 or more. And you get to pick which ones. The one that we're all most familiar with is passwords. That's something you know. So you have passwords, PINs, security questions. That's all one factor, something you know. The other big one is something you have. It's usually a token of some sort. You can get disconnected time-based one-time password tokens of various sorts. Essentially, if you've ever seen one of those RSA keys where you click a button and it shows a 6-digit code that you have to put in when you log in, that's probably one of the most secure forms. Software tokens, that does the same thing, but is an app on your phone. Also very secure, a little more convenient because now everybody has a smartphone and you don't have to remember to keep a little key fob on your keychain all the time. You can also get, from some providers, push authentication now, which in the background is doing that one-time password, but it's doing it for you so that you don't have to type in 6 digits. And if you're doing multi-factor on every system all day long, like you're supposed to with these controls, that improved user experience is huge. It's just so much faster, so much more convenient. People love the push confirm. Email, SMS, and voice also technically count as something you have, but they're not very secure. There's a lot of attack vectors for people to be able to hack SMS or email or voice. SIM cloning on phones is pretty easy to do on a lot of networks, to where somebody registers a fake SIM if they know your IED number and can get on the network. Now the text messages get sent to both phones, and so when they go to be presented with the 2-factor code, they get it on their phone as well. DNS attacks for email, also eavesdropping for voice. Those are all threat vectors if you're using email or SMS or voice for your second factor. There's also connected hardware tokens. A lot of DoD contractors are very familiar with cap cards. You plug it into your system, it has an X509 certificate on it that's unique to your user, and you can't log in without it. Those also exist in a USB form. Those are also very secure. And the third factor that counts for NIST is something you are, biometrics. And that's fingerprint, face, voice, or iris recognition. Others are coming out as well. Jury's still out on how robust those systems are and how easy is it to fake some of those things with like photographs of people that they're trying to impersonate. If you want my personal recommendation, I'm gonna say the software token with the push confirm gives you the very best of security plus good user experience, quick and easy to use. What are some factors that don't count? Because I see this a lot. If you read the supplementary material that goes along with the NIST controls that explain exactly what they mean, you'll find out MAC address restrictions don't count as a second factor. MAC addresses are extremely easy to eavesdrop and spoof on a network. If you're just listening passively on the network, you get to find out everybody's MAC, and if you want to impersonate some other device, you just go into your network settings and change it, and now that second factor just failed. So doesn't count for NIST. It also only works on layer 2 broadcast domains, so a local network. You can do MAC address restrictions, but can't do it on the internet. IPS address restrictions, somewhere you are, maybe. Not really, it's also pretty easy to spoof IP addresses, and so any UDP traffic that's one way, you can just put whatever IP address as the source that you want on it, and you've gotten through any IP address restrictions. Two-way TCP authentication protocols will still be protected if you have IP address restrictions, but it won't protect you against SYN floods or any other kind of DDoS. So it's not really a very effective strategy. Also, NAT can obscure the true source of somebody, so oftentimes you have hundreds, if not thousands, of users that are represented by a single public IP address, and so NIST says that really doesn't count for a second factor in any way, shape, or form. Also, GPS location restrictions. If you have, some systems use where you have to have a app on your phone that has GPS and it tells you your coordinates. Well, it's really easy to spoof your GPS coordinates too, and if you know where that place is that the person's supposed to be, you could be halfway around the world and just spoof your GPS coordinates and get in. Not to say that there isn't some merit in terms of security in general to some of these other strategies. They do provide some layer of protection, but they don't count for a multi-factor solution as far as NIST controls go. Any questions about multi-factor before we move on to clip number 2?
In the prior slide, you mentioned CAT cards, but in the prior slide to that slide, they mentioned CAT cards as potentially not a way to, so here we see the requirement for multi-factor should not be interpreted as requiring. So
it doesn't require a CAT card.
But you're saying, or at least within the industry, it is okay to potentially use X509 as the second factor.
You would have to have a second so if you get issued a CAT card, it's going to have a certain X509 certificate that they've issued to you. Your own system, because it's a different PKI infrastructure, is going to need a different X509 certificate on it, but you can often, I believe, with the newer cards, you can have multiple different certificates on the same card.
So if you use that for your first factor, would you still have to implement a second factor in the app?
The second factor would usually be your password, in addition to the CAT card.
Like if you're using your PKI card, it'd be your PIN.
Yeah,
But
so your PIN.
does the PIN get forwarded to the app? Or does the PIN allow me to access the cert on the card?
I think it's to access the card, but you've still got your two-factor. It's the something you know is the PIN, and something you have is the card.
Yeah, so they don't require that the different factors be separate systems out of band from one another. They can be in the same line, same app, even if it's to access the second
But
factor, like
my question there is, if the PIN doesn't come to the app still has one factor. Because they're just accepting the cert on their side.
Yeah. If the app server is only accepting the certificate and nothing else, then that would technically need another factor once you get to the app. But it all depends on how picky and precise does an auditor want to be, you know. Would they notice something like that? It depends on how big profile contractor they are. It's a good question though. Any other questions? before we go on? So, real quick, just some multi-factor authentication system examples that exist. Duo is a big one. Google Authenticator, Okta. You'll notice some of these were talked about in the directory services. If you're a cloud native company, a lot of cloud native directory services have multi-factor built in, which is pretty nice and convenient for sysadmins. You don't have to bring on some third-party solution to add on to your directory services. You can just include what you got in the system you already have. Yubico, Fortinet's Forti Authenticator, Authy. There's a bunch of other ones that exist. Mileage may vary. You got to find one that fits your use case. Clip number 2, item 151 on today's glitch list. Ray Arnold expresses concern over the growing list of dangerous unpatched bugs in the system.
Damn.
Vehicle headlights are on and they're not responding. Those shouldn't be running off car batteries. Item 151 on today's glitch list. We have all the problems of a major theme park and a major zoo, and the computers aren't even on their feet yet.
Dennis, our lives are in your hands and you have butterfingers?
I'm totally unappreciated in my time. You can run this whole park from this room with minimal staff for up to 3 days. You think that kind of automation is easy? Or cheap? You know anybody who can network 8 connection machines and debug 2 million lines of code for what I bid for this job? Because if you can, I'd love to see him try.
Sorry about your financial problems, Dennis. I really am, but they are your problems.
Oh, you're right, John. You're absolutely right. You know, everything's my problem.
I will not get drawn into another financial debate with you, Dennis. I really will not.
There's been hardly any debate at all.
I don't blame people for their mistakes, but I do ask that they pay for them.
Thanks, Dad.
Dennis, the headlights.
Yeah, I'll debug the tour program when they get back, okay? Okay? It'll eat a lot of compute cycles. We'll lose part of the system for a while. And there's a finite amount of memory. You can't use it for everything. We're going to compile for half an hour.
Quiet, all of you. We're approaching the Tyrannosaur pud.
How many of you ever been in that situation? Some critical bug in the system that could really become a problem later. We need to patch it. Sysadmin or programmer, developer, stressed for time, underpaid, underappreciated, and then life happens. Tyrannosaurus Rex shows up and you don't have time and you forget about it and you never actually get back to patching that bug. Happens all the time. There's a big section of NIST that deals with vulnerabilities in your systems, and it basically 311 requires you to have some sort of vulnerability management system that can keep track of all the vulnerabilities that exist, organize them as high, medium, or low, and report on them. And it is required for both workstations, servers, any networking gear. That's all part of that requirement. Fortunately, there's the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposure Database. It's a database of publicly known cybersecurity vulnerabilities that's maintained by the NCF, which is a partner of NIST, and can be queried through their Security Content Automation Protocol, or SCAP. It's publicly available and accessible to the whole world for the very purpose of securing your systems and becoming compliant. And in truth, most networks are riddled with CVEs everywhere. If you ask yourself how up to date are your security patches, you really don't know without having a system that collects all these things and reports on them. What a system like this will do for you is, scan the network and organize all these things into high, medium, low, and give you that report so you can evaluate the risk and remediate it. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to patch everything right away, but NIST does say that you need that system in place so that you at least know, and things that are critical and high can get patched right away. Things that are medium and low, you can have ways, and even things that are critical and high, it may be the case that you don't have to patch if these CVEs often have supplemental information about workarounds. Sometimes it's disabling access in a firewall to that system for that protocol that's affected. Sometimes it's disabling certain features in an app or a server that can still get you compliant without having to patch that system outright. But you'll be amazed if, you know, a lot of people think, oh, my systems are fairly up to date, but time and time again, real world examples, I've run these scans on systems and found Heartbleed still on an OpenSSL version on servers, you know, however many years later, 2+ years now, super high risk. I've seen Meltdown and Spectre on hypervisors that have multiple customers on the same and they're still at risk, and they've just never patched it because they're not looking at those things. So yeah, it's super critical that you have one of those as part of your security fabric for NIST compliance. A good compliance strategy, though, is to utilize managed service providers that are already doing that for themselves, whether that's on-premise or in the cloud. A lot of managed service providers, DataYard included, we do all those things for ourselves, managing our own vulnerabilities, and we have monthly patch cycles every month for regular patches. If there's critical security ones, we decide to do, you know, an out-of-band emergency patch if necessary, or to mitigate it at the firewall until next maintenance cycle. It's a great way to minimize your compliance burden. All your requirements can already be weighing down on you on all the other controls. If there's ways that you can offload certain systems to other providers that are already taking care of this for you, it's a great winning strategy. Any question about vulnerability management systems before we launch our final clip?
Are there commercial tools that do this?
Yes.
What
there
kind
are.
of tool? What can you name a few of them?
Logarithm is a big one. Alien Vault, Forta Client EMS, big ones coming to mind right now. There's some others out there. I'd say those are probably the three big players in that field right now.
One of the things that we utilize is Docker Hub has, if you have paid accounts with them, they automatically scan your containers as long as you are submitting them publicly.
Yeah.
You can get updates and things like that.
Yeah, and that's that compliance strategy of having somebody else, you know, take care of it for you. It's super effective to do that because you have limited resources on a lot of these teams. You maybe have 1 or 2 IT guys that are already burdened with so much, so definitely. But number 3, he covered his tracks, but we've never tested it. So this is when they've exhausted all efforts to figure out where Dennis Nedry is or what's going on. Everything's falling apart. People are getting eaten by dinosaurs. And John,
Dennis Nedry.
yeah. And John is like, we gotta shut the system down and reboot it to get things back on track. But they have some difficulties with that.
Key check space -O, key checks off, safety space -O. He's turning the safety systems off. He doesn't want anybody to see what he's about to do. Now, look at this next entry. It's the kicker. White rabbit object. Whatever it did it all. But with the key checks off, the computer didn't file the keystrokes, so the only way to find them now is to go through the computer's lines of code one by one.
How many lines of code are there?
About 2 million.
2 million.
Yeah.
Robert, I wonder if perhaps you would be good enough to take a gas jeep and bring back my grandchildren.
Sure.
I'm going with him.
John. I can't get Jurassic Park back online without Dennis Nedry. No, that's crazy. You're out of your mind. He's absolutely out of his mind.
Well, wait a minute. What exactly would this mean?
We're talking about a calculated risk, my dear, which is about the only option left to us. We will never find the command that Nedry used. He's covered his tracks far too well. And I think it's obvious now that he's not coming back. So, shutting down the entire system...
You can get somebody else because I won't do it. I will not.
Shutting down the system is the only way to wipe out everything that he did. Now, as I understand it, all the systems will then come back on their original startup mode. Correct?
Theoretically, yes, but we've never shut down the entire system before. It may not come back on at all.
Will we get the phones back?
Yes, again, in theory.
What about the lysine contingency? We could put that into effect.
What's that?
That is absolutely out of the question.
The lysine contingency is intended to prevent the spread of the animals in case they ever get off the island. Dr. Wu inserted a gene that creates a single faulty enzyme in protein metabolism. The animals can't manufacture the amino acid lysine. Unless they're completely supplied with lysine by us, they slip into a coma and die.
People are dying. Will you please shut down the system?
Hold on to your butts. It's okay. Look, see that? It's on. It worked.
Fortunately, it worked for them, but there were a lot of things that were going wrong. A couple of different controls that apply to this to take away. 314 is to separate the duties of individuals to reduce the risk of malevolent activity without collusion. That's exactly what happened in Jurassic Park. Dennis Nedry had control over everything, and nobody else had any idea what he was capable of doing or what he could do, and he had ways of covering his tracks. Without having some separation of duties, you're at risk for the same kind of scenario to happen in your environment. It's often difficult to do if you're only a 1 or 2 man shop. Augmented IT is a great cost-effective way to meet this requirement without having to bring on full-time staff who are capable of having multiple people also understand how the systems for AAA and SSO and all that work. You can get another set of eyes to help with documentation, with help with logging, help reporting, and that you put in your NIST compliance document for 314 that we have this third-party company that helps with maintaining these records and checking on them to make sure that there's not collusion happening on the network. If you do have more than 1 or 2 IT staff members, you often want to assign certain roles and responsibilities to each of them so that there's accountability between different individuals. Another takeaway on this is NIST 363, which is to test the organizational's incident response capability. So 361 and 362 essentially say you have to have a plan of how are you going to respond to security events. But then 363 says you actually have to test it, because a plan is only good in theory until you've actually tested it out. If you've ever heard of a backup and disaster recovery scenario, how many times have you heard of somebody who thought they had backups for their system? Turns out there was some problem with the backup system, and now you can't restore. So unless you're testing it on a regular basis, you really don't know. You don't have to shut down your whole system like they did in Jurassic Park. That was because they didn't have a good recovery incident plan. If you plan in advance, you can find ways to do simulated testing out of band that eliminates your business disruptions, but still that's your incident response plan. Some different strategies for that. You need a way to test your antivirus systems. The ICAR file, or the European Institute of Computer Antivirus Research, is essentially a non-malicious program that just writes out this is the ICAR test file to console. It can be used to test your antivirus systems through multiple different vectors. You should be testing that if you have antivirus through your firewall. Your firewall should block it. Your browser should even stop users from downloading it. If you write that file, just a text file, and you save it to a computer, it should automatically get quarantined. If you bring it in on a USB drive, all those different vectors that malware can get to a system, it should be caught and reported to the incident management system so that you know that somebody is being protected if antivirus should come in. If you don't test that, your antivirus is only working in theory. Same for your firewalls. You can pen test not only for IPs and ports, but even certain vulnerabilities like cross-site scripting, SQL injections. Your IDS, intrusion detection system on your firewall, should detect that you tested those things and report to your central reporting security staff to be able to say, hey, we know our firewall is really detecting these exploit attempts. Same with phish testing of users. We talked about how users are a big threat vector that gets forgotten about. If you might be training your staff on good OPSEC, but without phish testing your users, you really don't know how effective was your training. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into an environment where people thought, oh, my users have been trained on this, they know, they're pretty well. Company of 80, 90 people, you phish test them, and 30 fail the spear phishing test, 20 fail the net phishing test. It's super common. And then you get an automated report of who failed, who clicked the link, and now you can send them to remedial training. And you don't have to turn off your spam filter though. You don't want to just turn it off carte blanche to run this test, because now you're opening yourself up. You just whitelist the specific test that you want to do. And mail filters are a big reason why users continue to be bad at not falling for phishing tests, is because they kind of forget. Because our mail filters are very effective, 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, it never reaches the user, and they might go months or years without seeing a phishing email come through. But then the one that does could be the one that bites you. So phish test your users. You also want to test restoring of your backups. Backups are the best last line of defense against crypto locking attacks. But if you don't actually test the restore capabilities of those backups, you don't know how good they are. You don't have to, totally shut down a computer or reload it to do this. You can test it out of band on separate hypervisors for the purpose. And if that's too much of a investment capital expense to be able to do, you can do that in AWS or Azure or other cloud providers, DataYard included, to be able to actually test the VM restore capability of your servers. I think that's all the points I had. Did anybody have any questions on any of those? All right, well, just some closing remarks. If you're behind, don't fret, get some help. There are a lot of different parties and vendors that can help with these solutions. If you have compliance auditors showing up, whether it's from the government themselves or from other contractors, there are solutions to start helping with this process. It's not the end of the world, as long as you, like I said, as long as you have that plan in place, documented, written out, and that you're making progress towards it according to the timelines. You're not going to lose any government contracts. But also, a lot of people have just kind of been sleeping on this because they've imagined, oh, the government's slow to act. It took them 12 years just to define this standard. Is anything really bad going to happen to me? Well, maybe not this year, but eventually. And you don't want to play that risk game too long. So get some help if you're behind on your progress.